My name is Andy Zee. I'm the spokesperson for Revolution Books, where you are and where you should be as often as you can be, because this is the place where people come from all around the world to find the books and the engagement with each other, to find out and to discover why the world is the way it is, how we got here, the underlying history, the present-day reality. And more than that, they come to find out if there's a way out, and indeed at Revolution Books they can find that there is a way out in the new communism, the new synthesis of communism developed by Bob Avakian, who's the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party and who works at the foundation of the store, and is in its heart a more scientific way that people can understand reality and find the pathways to change it. So you're at Revolution Books and surrounded by these, what is a tremendous resource for New York City, for Harlem, and for the world. Tonight we are very pleased to have Yaa Gyasi with us. How many of you have read Homegoing? Okay, so some of you are going to know about this in advance, and the rest of you are going to be anxious to read it when you go home. This is an extraordinary book, and it's also, and I don't say this about every book, it's also an important book. And I want to welcome Yaa Gyasi to Harlem, and these very streets, for those of you who read the book, are the very streets where Willie and Sonny and Marcus walk and encounter life in America after a history of hundreds of years that you will learn about from Yaa Gyasi. So here's how tonight is going to go. I'm going to sit down. Yaa's going to come up, and she's going to do a program for as long as she wants. Okay, and then I'm going to give a talk very briefly to you, maybe 5 minutes, about Revolution Books and why you should support this bookstore, why it matters, and why for it to continue to matter requires you and your financial and your political and your personal support for the store itself. And then we're going to have a discussion. I'm going to start some questions with Yaa first, and then we're going to open it up, and all of you can ask questions. And then you can get a copy of the book, and Yaa will be generous enough to sign your books and to meet each of you individually. Now I want to ask you first, and I actually mean this, for those of you who don't have, or for those of you who have iPhones and any other kind of phone, turn them off, okay? And as a general matter, people with cell phones that have batteries that remove, take the batteries out too. That's a very good thing to learn how to do, so that we can have programs here, and frankly in any progressive venue, where people can feel confident that what they say in that program stays in the room, and it isn't the property or knowledge of the NSA or any other institution. But also, it's a matter of courtesy and your focus. As much as you may want to tell your friends what Yaa is saying, you can tell them later on. There's no need to text them now. So please turn off your phones, and there's no video recording or audio recording. We are taping this program, or digitally recording it. It will be up online soon. You can watch it. You can send the links to your friends. However, after the program, if Yaa agrees to this, you can take a photo with her. I don't know if that becomes a selfie or not, but whatever it becomes, you're going to be able to do that. So with that, I would like to have you join me in welcoming Yaa Gyasi to Revolution Books and to celebrate the publication of Homegoing.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to read from Nessa's chapter. Nessa is the fourth character in this novel. And just to give you a little bit of the background, Homegoing is a novel that follows the family lineage of two half-sisters. The first half-sister, Afia, is the Fanti wife of the British governor of the Cape Coast Castle. And the Cape Coast Castle is a slave fort in present-day Ghana, what used to be known as the Gold Coast. Afia's half-sister, Essie, is kept in the castle as a slave before being sent to America. And so the novel kind of just goes down the line, back and forth from the Ghanaian side of the family to the American side of the family. And Ness is the first character to be born on American soil. She is a slave on an Alabama plantation. So I'll just dive right in. There was no drinking gourd, no spiritual soothing enough to mend a broken spirit. Even the Northern Star was a hoax. Every day, Ness picked cotton under the punishing eye of the southern sun. She had been at Thomas Allen Stockham's Alabama plantation for 3 months. 2 weeks before, she was in Mississippi. A year before that, she was in a place she would only ever describe as hell. Though she had tried, Ness couldn't remember how old she was. Her best guess was 25, but each year since the one when she was plucked from her mother's arms had felt like 10 years. Ness's mother, Essie, had been a solemn, solid woman who was never known to tell a happy story. Even Ness's bedtime stories had been ones about what Essie used to call the big boat. Ness would fall asleep to the images of men being thrown into the Atlantic Ocean like anchors attached to nothing. No land, no people, no worth. In the big boat, Essie said they were stacked 10 high, and when a man died on top of you, his weight would press the pile down like cooks pressing garlic. Ness's mother, called Frowny by the other slaves because she never smiled, used to tell the story of how she'd been cursed by a little dove long, long ago. Cursed and sisterless, she would mutter as she swept, left without her mother's stone. When they sold Ness in 1796, Essie's lips had stood in that same thin line. Ness could remember reaching out for her mother, flailing her arms and kicking her legs, fighting against the body of the man who'd come to take her away. And still, Essie's lips had not moved. Her hands had not reached out. She stood there, solid and strong, the same as Ness had always known her to be. And though Ness had met warm slaves on other plantations, black people who smiled and hugged and told nice stories, she would always miss the gray rock of her mother's heart. She would always associate real love with a hardness of spirit. Thomas Allen Stockham was a good master, if such a thing existed. He gave them 5-minute breaks every 3 hours, and the field slaves were allowed onto the porch to receive 1 mason jar full of water from the house slaves. This day, in late June, Ness waited in line for water beside Tim Tam. He was a gift to the Stockham family from their neighbors, the Whitmans, and Tom Allen often liked to say that Tim Tam was the best gift he had ever received, better even than the gray-tailed cat his brother had given him for his 5th birthday, or the red wagon he'd received for his 2nd. "How's your day been?" Tim Tam asked. Ness turned toward him just slightly. "Ain't all days the same?" Tim Tam laughed, a sound that rumbled like thunder built from the cloud of his gut and expelled through the sky of his mouth. "I suppose you're right," he said. Ness was not certain she would ever get used to hearing English spill out of the lips of black people. In Mississippi, Essie had spoken to her in Twi until their master caught her. He'd given Essie 5 lashes for every Twi word Ness spoke, and when Ness, seeing her battered mother, had become too scared to speak, he gave Essie 5 lashes for each minute of Ness's silence. Before the lashes, her mother had called her Mame, after her own mother, but the master had whipped Essie for that too, whipped her until she cried out, "My goodness," the words escaping her without thought, no doubt picked up from the cook who used to say it to punctuate every sentence. And because those had been the first English words to escape Essie's mouth without her struggling to find them. She believed that what she was saying must have been something divine, like the gift of her daughter. And so that goodness had turned into simply Ness. "Where you coming from?" Tim Tam asked. He chewed the chaffy end of a wheat stalk and spit. "You ask too many questions," Ness said. She turned away. It was her turn to receive water from Margaret, the head house slave, but the woman poured only enough to fill a quarter of the glass. "We ain't got enough today," she said. But Ness could see that the buckets of water on the porch behind her were enough to last a week. Margaret looked at Ness, but Ness got the feeling that she was really looking through her, or rather, that she was looking 5 minutes into Ness's past, trying to discern whether or not the conversation Ness had just had with Tim Tam meant that the man was interested in her. Tim Tam cleared his throat. "Now, Margaret," he said, "that ain't no kind of way to treat somebody." Margaret glared at him and plunged her ladle into the bucket, but Ness didn't accept the offering. She walked away, leaving the two people to stew. While there may have been a piece of paper declaring that she belonged to Tom Allen Stockham, there was no such paper shackling her to the whims of her fellow slaves. "You ain't gotta be so hard on him," a woman said once Ness resumed her position in the field. The woman seemed older, mid to late 30s, but her back hunched even when she stood up straight. "You new here, so you don't know. Tim Tam done lost his woman long while ago, and he been taking care of little Pinky by himself ever since." Ness looked at the woman. She tried to smile, but she had been born during the years of Essie's unsmiling, and she had never learned how to do it quite right. The corners of her lips always seemed to twitch upward unwillingly, then fall within milliseconds, as though attached to that sadness that had once anchored her own mother's heart. "Ain't we all done lost someone?" Ness asked. Ness was too pretty to be a field nigger. That's what Tom Allen said to her the day he'd taken her back to his plantation. He'd bought her on good faith from a friend of his in Jackson, Mississippi, who said she was one of the best field hands he'd ever seen, but to make quite sure to only use her in the field. Seeing her, light-skinned with kinked hair that raced down her back in search of her round shelf of a buttocks, Tom Allen thought his friend must have made some kind of mistake. He pulled out the little outfit he liked for his house niggers to wear, a white button-down with a boat neckline and capped sleeves, a long black skirt attached to a little black apron. He'd had Margaret take Ness into the back room so that she could change into it, and Ness had done what she was told. Margaret, seeing Ness all done up, clutched her hand to her heart and told Ness to wait there. Ness had to press her ear to the wall to hear what Margaret said. "She ain't fit for the house," Margaret told Tom Allen. "Well, let me see her, Margaret. I'm sure I can decide for myself whether or not somebody's fit to work in my own house. Now, can't I?" "Yes, sir," Margaret said. "I reckon you is, but it ain't something you gon' want to see is what I'm saying." Tom Allen laughed. His wife, Susan, came into the room and asked what all the fuss was about. "Why, Margaret's got our new nigger locked up in the back and won't let us see her. Stop this nonsense and go fetch her here." If Susan was like any of the other master's wives, she must have known that her husband's bringing a new nigger into the house meant she had better pay attention. In this and every other southern county, men's eyes and other body parts had been known to wander. "Yes, Margaret, bring the girl so we can see. Don't be silly about it." Margaret shrugged her shoulders and went back to the room, and Ness pulled her ear from the wall. "Well, you best come out," was all Margaret said. And so Ness did. She walked out to her audience of two, her shoulders bared as well as the bottom halves of her calves, and when Susan Stockham saw her, she fainted outright. It was all Tom Allen could do to catch his wife while shouting at Margaret to go change Ness at once. Margaret rushed her into the back room and left in search of field clothes, and Ness stood in the center of that room, running her hands along her body, reveling in her ugly nakedness. She knew It was the intricate scars on her bare shoulders that had alarmed them all. But the scars weren't just there. No, her scarred skin was like another body in and of itself, shaped like a man hugging her from behind with his arms hanging around her neck. They went up from her breasts, rounded the hills of her shoulders, and traveled the full, proud length of her back. They licked the top of her buttocks before trailing away into nothing. Ness's skin was no longer skin, really, more like the ghost of her past made seeable, physical. She didn't mind the reminder. Margaret came back in the room with a headscarf, a brown top that covered the shoulders, a red skirt that went all the way to the floor. She watched Ness put them on. And so Ness worked in the field. It was not new to her. In hell, she'd worked the land too. In hell, the sun scorched cotton so hot it almost burned the palms of your hands to touch it. Holding those small white puffs almost felt like holding fire, but God forbid you let one drop. The devil was always watching. Hell was where she had learned to be a good field hand, and the skill had carried her all the way to Tuscumbia. It was her second month at the Stockham plantation. She lived in one of the women's cabins, but she had made no friends. Everyone knew her as the woman who had snubbed Tim Tam, and the ladies, angry when they thought she was the object of his desire, and even angrier when they realized that she didn't want to be that object, treated her as though she were little more than a strong wind, an annoyance that you could still push through. In the mornings, Ness prepared her pail to take out to the field with her. Cornmeal cakes, a bit of salt pork, and, if she was lucky, some greens. In hell, she had learned to eat standing up, picking cotton with her right hand, shoveling food in with her left. It wasn't something she was required to do here at Tom Allen's, work while eating, but she didn't know any other way. "Look like she thinks she better than us," one woman called, just loudly enough so Ness could hear. "Tom Allen sure gon' think so," another one said. "Nuh-uh, Tom Allen ain't paid her no mind since she got kicked out the big house," the first one said. Ness had learned how to tune the voices out. She tried to remember the Twi that Essie used to speak to her, tried to still her mind until all that was left was the thin, stern line of her mother's lips, lips that used to usher out words of love in a tongue that Ness could no longer quite grasp. Phrases and words would come to her, mismatched or lopsided, wrong. She worked all day like this, listening to the sounds of the South, the insistent buzz of mosquitoes, that screech of cicadas, the hum of slave gossip. At night, she would return to her quarters, beat out her palette until dust billowed from it, wrapping around her like a hug. She would set it back down again and wait for a sleep that rarely came, trying her best to still the harrowing images that danced behind her closed eyelids. It was on a night like this, just when she had snapped her palette into the air, that the pounding started, fists beating against the door of the women's cabin in a steady, urgent rhythm. "Please," a voice called, "please help us." A woman named Mavis opened the door. Tim Tam stood there, cradling his daughter Pinky in his arms. He pushed into the room, his voice choked, though there were no tears in his eyes. "I think she got what her mama had," he said. The women cleared a spot for the girl, and Tim Tam set her down before he started to pace. "Oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord," he cried. "You best go fetch the doctor," Ruthie said. "Doctor ain't helped last time," Tim Tam said. Ness stood behind a row of women, their shoulders squared as if headed into battle. She pushed her way through to the center to catch a glimpse of the child. Pinky was small and sharp-edged, as though her body were built from sticks with no bend to them. Her hair was tied up in two big puffs. The whole time the women were watching her, she made no noise save for a quick intake of breath. "Ain't nothing wrong with her," Ness said. Suddenly, Tim Tam stopped his pacing as everyone turned to stare at Ness. "You ain't been round here long," Tim Tam said. "Pinky ain't spoke a word since her mama died, and now she can't stop with these hiccups. Ain't nothing but hiccups, Ness said. Those ain't killed anyone yet, as far as I know. She looked around at all the women, shaking their heads at her disapprovingly, but she couldn't tell what she had done wrong. Tim Tam pulled her aside. These women ain't told you, he whispered, and Ness shook her head. The women so rarely spoke to her, and she had finally gotten good at tuning out their gossip. Tim Tam cleared his throat and hung his head a little lower. See, we know ain't nothing wrong with her but the hiccups, but we've been trying to get her to speak, so... His voice trailed off as Ness began to understand that the whole thing had been nothing more than a plot to trick little Pinky into utterance. Ness pulled away from Tim Tam and looked at the small congregation of women carefully, from one to the next and then the next. She made her way to the center of the room, where Pinky lay on her pallet, her eyes staring up at the ceiling. The girl turned her eyes toward Ness and hiccuped once more. Ness addressed the room. Lord, I don't know what kind of foolishness I done walked into at this here plantation, but y'all need to leave this girl alone. Maybe she don't want to speak 'cause she know just how crazy it make you. Or maybe she ain't got nothing to say yet, but I reckon she ain't gonna start talking tonight just because y'all making like actors in a traveling show. The women wrung their hands and shifted their feet, and Tim Tam's head sunk a little lower. Ness walked back to her pallet, finished beating the dust out, and lay down. Tim Tam walked over to Pinky. Well, let's go, he said, reaching for the girl, but she pulled away. I said, let's go, he repeated, shame coloring his voice gray, but the girl snatched herself away again. She went over to where Ness lay, her eyes shut tightly as she begged sleep to come quick. Pinky's hand brushed Ness's shoulder, and she opened her eyes to see the girl staring at her. And because Ness understood loss, and because she understood motherlessness and wanting and even silence, she reached for the girl's hand and pulled her down onto the bed. You go on ahead, she said to Tim Tam, Pinky's head already nestled between the soft cushions of her breasts. I got her tonight. From that day forward, Pinky could not be separated from Ness. She had even moved from the other women's cabin into Ness's. She slept with Ness, ate with Ness, took walks with Ness, and cooked with Ness. Still, she didn't speak, and Ness never asked her to, knowing full well that Pinky would speak when she had something to say, laugh when something was truly funny. For her part, Ness, who had not known how much she missed company, took comfort in the girl's quiet presence. Pinky was the water girl. On any given day, she would make as many as 40 trips to the small creek on the edge of the Stockham's plantation. She carried a plank of wood across her back, arms folded over it from behind, so that she looked like a man holding a cross, and on each end of the plank hung 2 silver pails. Once she had reached the creek, Pinky would fill those pails, bring them back to the main house, and then empty them into the large water buckets that lived on the Stockham porch. She would fill the basins in the house so that the Stockham children would have fresh water for their afternoon baths. She would water the flowers that sat on Susan Stockham's dressing table. From there, she went to the kitchen to give 2 pailfuls to Margaret for the day's cooking. She walked the same worn path every day, down to the creek, back up to the house. By the end of the day, her arms would throb so hard, Ness could feel her heart beat in them when the girl crawled into bed with Ness at night and the woman held her close. The hiccups had not stopped, continuing since the day Tim Tam had brought her into Ness's cabin, hoping to scare the child into speaking. Everyone pitched in with a remedy. Stand the girl upside down. Tell her hold her breath and swallow. Cross 2 straws on top her head. The last remedy, put forth by a woman named Harriet, was the one that seemed to work. Pinky made 34 trips to the creek without a single hiccup. Ness was on the porch getting her fill of water on Pinky's 35th trip back. The 2 red-headed Stockham children were out and about that day, the boy named Tom Jr. and the girl, Mary. They were running up the stairs just as Pinky rounded the corner, and Tom Jr. knocked the plank so that one of the pails went flying into the air, water raining down on everyone on the porch. Mary started to cry. "My dress is all wet," she said. Margaret, who had just finished ladling out water for one of the other slaves, set the ladle down. "Hush now, Miss Mary." Tom Jr., who had never been much for gallantry, decided to try it just then for his sister's sake. "Well, apologize to Mary," he said to Pinky. The two were the same age, though Pinky was about a foot taller. Pinky opened her mouth, but no words came out. "She's sorry," Ness said quickly. "I wasn't talking to you," Tom Jr. said. Mary had stopped crying and was staring at Pinky intently. "Tom, you know she don't talk," Mary said. "It's all right, Pinky." "She'll talk if I tell her to talk," Tom Jr. said, shoving his sister. "Apologize to Mary," he repeated. The sun was high and hot that day. Indeed, Ness could see that the 2 wet drops on Mary's dress had already dried. Pinky, eyes welling with tears, opened her mouth again, and a wave of hiccups exploded, frantic and loud. Tom Jr. shook his head. He went into the house while everyone watched and returned with the Stockham cane. It was twice his length, made of a dull birch wood. It wasn't thick, but it was so heavy that Tom Jr. could hardly hold it with both of his hands, let alone the one it would take to snap it back. "Speak, nigger," Tom Jr. said. And Margaret, who had long since stopped her ladling, ran into the house crying, "Ooh, Tom Jr., I'm gonna find your daddy." Pinky was sobbing and hiccuping all at once, the hiccups blocking whatever speech she might have given. Tom Jr. lifted the cane in his right hand with great effort and tried to snap it over his shoulder, but Ness, who was standing behind him, caught the tip of it in her hand. It tore through her palms as she tugged so hard that Tom Jr. fell to the ground. She dragged him 1/2 inch. Tom Allen appeared on the porch with Margaret, who was breathless and clutching her chest. "What's this?" he asked. Tom Jr. started crying. "She was gonna hit me, Daddy," he said. Margaret tried to speak up. "Massa Tom, you lie, you was..." Tom Allen raised his hand to stop Margaret's speech and looked at Ness. Maybe he remembered the scars on her shoulders, remembered how they had kept his wife laid up in bed for the rest of that day and put him off his dinner for a week. Maybe he wondered what a nigger had to do to earn stripes like that, what trouble a nigger like that must be capable of. And there his son was on the ground with dirt on his shorts and the mute child Pinky crying. Ness was sure that he could see clear as day what had happened, but it was the memory of her scars that made him doubt. A nigger with scars like that and his son on the ground. There wasn't anything else he could do. "I'll deal with you soon enough," he said to Ness, and everyone wondered what would happen. That evening, Ness returned to the women's quarters. She crawled into her bed and closed her eyes, waiting for the images that played every night behind her lids to still to darkness. Beside her, Pinky began to hiccup. "Oh, Lord, here she go. Ain't we had enough trouble for one day," one of the women said. "Can't get no kind of rest when this girl starts to hiccup." Ashamed, Pinky slapped a hand to her mouth as though, with it, she could erect a wall to block the sound's escape. "Don't pay them no mind," Ness whispered. "Thinking about it only gonna make it worse." She didn't know if she was speaking to Pinky or to herself. Pinky squeezed her eyes tight as a series of hiccups came from her lips. "Leave her be," Ness said to the chorus of groans, and they listened. The events of the day had planted a little dual seed of respect and pity for Ness that they watered with deference of their own. They didn't know what Tom Allen would do. In the night, once they had all finally reached sleep, Pinky rolled over and snuggled into the soft skin of Ness's gut. Ness allowed herself to hold the girl, and she allowed herself to drift off into memory. She is back in hell. She is married to a man they call Sam, but who comes straight from the continent and speaks no English. The master of hell, the devil himself with red leather skin and a shock of gray hair, prefers his slaves married for reasons of insurance. And because Ness is new to hell, and because no one has claimed her, she is given to calm the new slave, Sam. At first, they do not speak to each other. Ness doesn't understand his strange tongue, and she is in awe of him, for he is the most beautiful man that she has ever seen, with skin so dark and creamy that looking at it could very well be the same thing as tasting it. His is the large, muscular body of the African beast, and he refuses to be caged, even with Ness as his welcoming gift. Ness knows that the devil must have paid a great deal of money for him, and therefore expects hard work. But nothing anyone does seems to tame him. On his first day, he fights with another slave, spits on the overseer, and is stood on a platform and whipped in front of everyone until the blood on the ground is high enough to bathe a baby. Sam refuses to learn English. Each night, in retribution for his still black tongue, the devil sends him back to their marriage bed with lashes that are reopened as soon as they heal. One night, enraged, Sam destroys the slave quarters. Their room is savaged from wall to wall, and when the devil hears of the destruction, he comes to serve punishment. I did it, Ness says. She has spent the night hidden in the left corner of the room, watching this man she's been told is her husband become the animal he's been told that he is. The devil shows no mercy, even though he knows she is lying, even though Sam tries time and again to accept the blame. She is beaten until the whip snaps off her back like pulled taffy, and then she is kicked to the ground. When he leaves, Sam is crying and Ness is barely conscious. Sam's words come out in a thick and feverish prayer, and Ness can't understand what he's saying. He picks her up gingerly and places her on their pallet. He leaves the house in search of the herbal doctor 5 miles away, who comes back with the roots and leaves and salves that are smeared into Ness's back as she slips in and out of consciousness. It is the first night that Sam sleeps in the cot with her, and in the morning, when she wakes to fresh pain and festered sores, she finds him sitting at her feet, peering at her face with his big, tired eyes. "I'm sorry," he says. They are the first English words he ever speaks, to her, to anyone. That week, they work side by side in the fields, and the devil, though watchful, does not act against them. In the evenings, they return to their bed, but they sleep on opposite sides of it, never touching. Some nights, they fear that the devil is watching them as they lie, and those are the nights Sam hugs her body to his, waiting for the metronome of fear that keeps her heart's drumbeat moving quickly to slow. His vocabulary has grown to include her name and his, don't worry, and quiet. In a month, he will learn love. In a month, once the wounds on both of their backs have hardened to scars, they finally consummate their marriage. He picks her up so easily, she thinks she must have turned into one of the rag dolls she makes for the children to play with. She has never been with a man before, but she imagines that Sam is not a man. For her, he has become something much larger than a man, the Tower of Babel itself, so close to God that it must be toppled. He runs his hands along her scabby back, and she does the same along his. And as they work together, clutching each other, some scars reopen. They are both bleeding now, both bride and bridegroom, in this unholy, holy union. Breath leaves his mouth and enters hers, and they lie together until the roosters crow, until it's time to return to the fields. Ness awoke to Pinky's finger poking her shoulder. "Ness, Ness," she spoke. Ness turned to face the girl, trying to hide her surprise. "Was you having a bad dream?" she asked. "No," Ness said. It looked like you was having a bad dream, the girl said, disappointed because when she was lucky, Ness told her stories. It was bad, Ness replied, but it wasn't no dream. That's it. Thank you.
You got to let that sit with you for a minute. But join me in another round of appreciation. If I didn't have something as important as keeping this bookstore open, I wouldn't have much to say after that. But it does really matter that there's a place that can take you back 160, 170 years to experience through a novel, through a story. What you can also learn here through books like The Half Has Never Been Told, The Empire of Cotton, and the other books that we have here on the history of black people in America and the history of Africa as well. And not just that, the history of the whole world. And it really matters that there's a place where you can discover that and connect that to get underneath the surface of why there was that peculiar institution that marks and is at the foundation, along with the genocide of the Native Americans of this country. It matters that there's a place where you can get deep beneath that and understand the connection to the terror that Ness and Pinky felt, to the terror that is felt in Baltimore and Milwaukee and Baton Rouge and Ferguson and just round the corner. And that at Revolution Books you can find out what it is we can do about that and how we can get to a system that is fit for human beings. And that lies in, as I said earlier, the new synthesis of communism, the understanding of what it would actually take to make a revolution in this country and what it does here and around the world. And Yaa did not read from the other half of the tree of this family, these two sisters, but the history of the continent of Africa and what colonialism wrought there. But I'm not going to take the time today to go into all of the reasons for that. That's what you can discover here. And you can get into, there's a book here, a pamphlet I do want to just commend to you, and then I'm going to move to what it is I'm going to ask you to do. This is called Communism and Jeffersonian Democracy by Bob Avakian. This is a book that gets under the roots of how it is that you could have a country that talks about the equality of all people, the rights of human beings, the rights of man, written by the Founding Fathers, and as Avakian says, it is Founding Fathers in a country rooted in patriarchy. But how 4 of the first 5 presidents were slave owners, and it wasn't just hypocrisy that enabled them to write what they wrote, but it actually was the fact that they didn't regard the native people or the black people they brought over from Africa as human beings, such that it made them different than their forebears in England and in Europe, who would look out at the people who did the work for them and see that they looked like them. But here in America, the founders didn't regard other people as human, and so they could write about the rights of white men and try to universalize that to everyone. And these roots of white supremacy are woven into the fabric of capitalism we face today. But that stuff you can learn here, and you can connect up with a movement that's trying to make that real, that's fighting against the power today and transforming the thinking of people for revolution right now. If you want to find out more about that, join me on Sunday afternoon, and Noche Diaz from the Revolution Club and other people who are here in the afternoon to meet the revolution. But what I want to talk to you about now is Revolution Books. We've been here since November 15th, when our dear friend and the great author Ngugi wa Thiong'o opened the store with me. And we raised almost $100,000. And if you want to count in the labor and the work of students and volunteers and people from the neighborhood, people who brought food and people who spackled the walls and tore down the old beauty parlor that was in here, it was far more than that. But that wasn't enough money to open the store. It was enough money to open the store, but it wasn't enough money to keep you cool tonight. I hope that neither Yaa nor I fall off this 4-foot stage. There is a design for an 8-foot stage that needs your financial support. There's a need for a sign, but more than that, there's a need for even more books. There's thousands of books in this store: literature, U.S. history, libros revolución, children's books. But there aren't enough books. But more than that, there aren't enough people who know about Revolution Books. And that takes money too, for flyers. One thing we do have but could use more of is volunteers. And some of you are here today, and they go out to Harlem Hospital, to music festivals, to theaters, and pass out flyers. Maybe some of you are here tonight because you got a flyer from one of these young people, and some older people too who do this. But it costs money for these flyers. Revolution Books needs your support. Now, I'm not saying the store is going to close tomorrow without your support, but I am going to tell you straight up it's unsustainable without your support. We can't keep losing money every month. So I'm asking you to do 3 things. Well, maybe 4. 1, Indiegogo. It's a crowd fundraising website. We're in a campaign to raise $25,000 to get those new things that I talked about: the air conditioning, the stage, the awning, the books, all of this kind of stuff. We're 2/3 of the way there, and right at the present moment we have a matching grant for $2,000, and we're raised $1,000 of that, and by tomorrow night we need to raise the other $1,000. If each of you'd go home tonight, donate $50 or $100, we'd be there, and it wouldn't just add another $1,000, it will add $3,000 and put us over $20,000 and close to that goal. I'm sorry? $4,000. Right, but okay, $4,000. She's right. I know a lot of political theory. Arithmetic maybe isn't my strong suit. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, become a friend of Revolution Books, which means sustain the store. You become a monthly sustainer, and if you sustain at a level, I believe it's $30 a month. It's deducted from whatever you have, bank account, credit card, or you can come in and give it in cash. You get 6 free books a year. You come in free to events. But most important, you get a center of a movement for an actual revolution and a bookstore, Revolution Books. So become a sustainer of Revolution Books. All right, so that's number 2. Memory isn't also one of my strong suits. Number 3, I'm just kidding. Number 3, volunteer at Revolution Books. We need you to volunteer. There's lots to do here. It's probably the most interesting thing you'll do. Can some of the volunteers stand up who are here tonight? Okay, you can talk to all these people. They will tell you about it. And the last thing you can do, number 4, we mean both words of our name. Yes, the meaning of the store, the essence of the store is revolution. But the second part of our name is books. So there's 2 things you need to do there. One is read them. And for those of you who don't have the money to read, there is a lending library here. But for those of you who do have the money, come buy books. It not only supports Revolution Books, it supports authors. It supports writers. And without this, the collective knowledge of humanity will be lost. You cannot capture that collective knowledge in 146 characters. I'm sorry. Yes, the collective knowledge that's inside Donald Trump's brain can fit in 146 characters, and that will cause you a world of trouble. We need people to read books and to talk about books and to discuss that, and that's what we do here at Revolution Books. So with that, Yaa Gyasi and I are going to have a conversation. We're going to open up to all of you, but do not forget what I just asked you. Go to Indiegogo tonight. Make a donation. If you don't have internet at home, you can go on the internet here. If you don't have the credit cards or debit cards, you can do that donation in cash here, and it can get entered that way. Become a sustainer, read books, and volunteer. So that's my message to all of you, and thank you for coming to Revolution Books, and I'm looking forward to our conversation with Yaa Gyasi. So just on a personal note, I found the book beautiful, but hearing it was a whole other experience. For those of you who've read the book, I just have to say, not only is it a tribute to your reading skill, but the words just really flow. So I just first, for those who don't know you, I'm going to ask a very basic question.
Okay.
Not who are you, but also, I know you've been asked to tell the story before, but maybe talk about who you are and the trip you took that was the genesis of the book.
Sure. So I was born in Ghana, and then my family moved to America. We lived in Ohio, Illinois, Tennessee, and then Alabama. And we moved to Alabama when I was 9 years old. We left Ghana when I was 2. And I think, just kind of growing up in Alabama, in a country where the effects of slavery are still so strongly, in a state where the effects of slavery are still so strongly felt, and coming from a country that had this role in slavery, I was kind of always interested in it, but didn't know very much about kind of the Ghanaian history as it pertained to the slave trade. My sophomore year of college, I received a grant to travel to Ghana and do research for a novel. And I'd had a different idea in mind. I wanted to write a book about a mother and her daughter, and I wanted to go to the central region of Ghana where my own mother is from and just kind of soak it in and see if anything became of it. And while I was there, I wasn't really feeling very inspired. A friend came to visit, and kind of on a whim, we decided to go see the Cape Coast Castle. And that experience kind of totally changed the course of my life. It is the reason why this book was written. Any tourist who goes. And the tour guide walked us around and started to talk to us about how the British soldiers who lived and worked in the castle at this time would sometimes marry the local women, which was something I had never heard before, never really thought about before. And then from there, he took us down to see the dungeons. And really, there's nothing I can compare that experience of standing in that dungeon to. And I was only in there for 5 minutes at the most. It's an area that still smells, that's still dirty and grimy, and just hundreds and hundreds of years of this horrible practice is still held in that space. And so I was standing there and thinking about the fact that there could be women down here in the dungeon, while up above there were free women and men who were probably unaware to some extent of what was about to become of the captives, as the captives themselves were unaware. And so that was the kind of beginning of this book for me, the idea of juxtaposing those two women, the wife of a British soldier and a Ghanaian captive herself. And so I took some notes. I came back to America after that summer and started to work on the book. And this whole process has been about 7 years from that day to now. Yeah.
So I know you've been asked about this line in the book, but I think people's experience, just hearing the chapter about Ness maybe brings this to life. You say that no one forgets that they were once captive, even if they were now free. When someone does wrong, one of the characters says, whether it is you or me, whether it is mother or father, whether it is Gold Coast man or the white man, it is like a fisherman casting a net into the water. He keeps only the one or two fish that he needs to feed himself and puts the rest in the water, thinking that their lives will go back to normal. No one forgets that they were once captive, even if they were now free. So, for those of you who don't know, the book is two sisters who actually have never met. They were separated and never met at a very young age. And one of them becomes a slave, the other becomes in the more privileged caste in Ghana, although she endures her own set of horrors. But could you talk a little bit about this quote?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the reasons that I really wanted to have a novel that covered so much time. The novel begins in 18th century Ghana, but it ends in present day America. And it was really important to me to have it end in present day America, because I felt as though this novel was really kind of about the lasting legacy of slavery. I didn't want it to be the kind of thing where you could read it and kind of forget this history. I wanted to kind of to talk about how so much of what we see in the present is kind of a direct result from all of these moments that came before it, and that this present moment didn't come out of nowhere. And so it was important to me to kind of use this novel as a way to trace, I suppose, the long tail of history. I didn't want to write a book that was, just about the present or just about the slave trade. I wanted it to cover a very long period of time.
Well, it really is extraordinary in the going back and forth between the history of the family in Ghana and here, and the arc of the actual novel is about 275 years, but it's really 400 years of history. Later on in the book, one of the characters says, I'm just also trying to do this without giving the book away, which is really hard, okay? Sometimes you cannot see the evil in the world begin. Sometimes you cannot see that the evil in the world began as the evil in your home. And I know this is controversial to actually talk about the slaving that went on in Africa and in Ghana, those who traded in slaves and those who captured slaves, and some have criticized, well, really you shouldn't bring that out, and for different reasons. I mean, this is true of other cultures that have gone through the same kind of experience, although nothing quite as horrific as the Middle Passage and slavery in America, which has certainly reached levels of brutality that slavery nowhere else has. But people do, on the one hand, don't want to confront that history. But on the other, they're afraid of, and have with justification, of what happens when this history gets in the hands of those who have oppressed people. Does this become an excuse for the barbarity that follows and all of this? And yet, if we don't pull the lens back and examine the world as it actually is and how it's actually developed and what were the causes, what was the nature of the society, what was the kind of place, why was this a viable alternative for people who were beginning to be colonized and dealing with these armies, and there's some of the slavery pre-existed that, although it was different than what came to be in America. So I just thought this would be something worth exploring, because it is important to confront the evil in your own house, but it's even more important to not see it as evil, but to see that it's evil in the sense that the systems we've lived under have caused people to do horrific things at different times and in different ways in different societies. But within the characters in the book and within humanity as a whole, we also have the capacity for love and for doing great things and for cooperation. And this gets undermined by the system itself. So in one sense, yes, I'm putting a little bit of what I think into this, but I think this is, I'd like to just explore this a little bit more, because it's something that I've read people not liking this. And I do feel if you will confront your actual history, wherever you're from, whatever culture you come from, whatever the history is, you will be not capable fully of being able to understand how the hell humanity ever gets free. And so I just think this is a very important and a brave confrontation that goes on in this book in a very poetic way.
Yeah, I mean, this information is available. It's just not something that people talk about loudly. You know, it's kind of spoken in whispers. When I took this tour, I was so struck by the fact that my mother grew up, you know, just 52 miles from this castle, and yet it's not something we ever talked about in my own home. And I just felt as though, you know, we shouldn't have to travel to Ghana and take this tour in order to get this kind of information. It should be more readily available. And I will say also that I hope that the book makes clear that while there were certainly people from the Gold Coast who were exploiting others, they were simultaneously being exploited. And you can never lose sight of that, the fact that this was a circle that was fed by greed on so many people's side, and that none of us are you know, outside of that. We're kind of all kind of wrapped up in this.
Well, before opening up, I have one more question that you are welcome to just say, I'm not going to talk about that, okay? Because I don't know how to do it without spoiling the book. But one of the things that struck me, so don't worry, I'm not going to do that. There's two elements that run through the book. You've got the story of Pinky, right? Mm-hmm. Walking back and forth with carrying the water with her, and then Ness suffering for the drops that fell on the young girl, the slave owner's daughter. But the metaphor of water and the metaphor of fire run through this book. I mean, they're very real in the book. They're not just metaphors, but there's also a metaphor there. Is there any way you could talk about what these mean to you? And look, it's, you know, fire and ice is water and fire. These are two very powerful images through the book: the ocean and the flames. And if there's a way you could talk about it without spoiling the whole book. It so much struck me. I felt it very viscerally through the course of it.
Sure, I will try. So the image that kind of opens the book, and the first image that came to me was of a fire in this village, and of the villager saying that this child was born of that fire. So Afia is that child. And for the rest of the novel, every person on Afia's side of the family is somehow implicated by that fire, or kind of comes into contact with that fire. And then on the other side, there's Essie, the other half-sister, who is kept in the dungeons before being sent along the Middle Passage. Her lineage, her descendants kind of come into contact with water throughout the family line. And that was just kind of a way for me to both juxtapose these two families while also kind of paying attention to those first two characters and their experiences, and how their children, their descendants might be, kind of wrapped up in those experiences.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come back to some of this, but let's get some questions from the audience. Now, before I see hands, is there somebody, assuming there's still people sitting out on Malcolm X Boulevard, Lenox Avenue, I would give them a first question if somebody can get the question from them, or maybe we'll give them the second questions and somebody can go out and find out if there's a question out there. But let me see some hands. Right up front here.
Hi, thank you for writing this book. It was so wonderful. So you mentioned that there are things that people don't talk about loudly a lot, and that you were telling in history some of that. Did this research make you want to look into other parts of American history, or like slavery and racial history, and did you discover anything that you think that we should all talk about?
Yeah, I think this project just kind of kept ballooning as I researched it. The more and more I researched it, the more I wanted to include in it, which is not a great thing to do as a writer. But one chapter in particular, H's chapter, takes place right after H has been arrested and is then a part of the convict leasing system that happened in this country. And that was a part of our history that I knew absolutely nothing about, like very, very little. If I'd ever heard about it, I don't remember. And delving into that research, I just was so struck by the fact that this was something that was happening in my home state of Alabama, and yet throughout school, nobody ever talked to me about it. And I'm sure there are more moments like that that aren't in this book. But yeah, I think the process of researching this was kind of a process of uncovering all of these different layers, both of depravity and also of really important struggle that these two different groups of people, Ghanaians and Americans, have come into contact with and done.
Is there a question from outside or no? Okay, so right up front here.
Thanks for reading the book.
Thank you.
One thing I thought I would bring up is right after the colonial oppression in South Africa came to an end, Desmond Tutu had there what he called Truth and Reconciliation meeting.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's something most countries all over the world should do. That way the oppressor, because not everybody is an oppressor. Like I grew up in colonial India where the British were less than kind to most Indians. But I, for one, never had any problem from any Britishman. I was taught by a couple of them. A couple of them were good teachers, at least as best I could judge. They were kind and understanding. So the advantage to this truth and reconciliation is the ones who are guilty of major oppression will have a chance voluntarily to come forward and say, listen, I was at a certain stage in my life when I didn't know things better. I'm guilty. Maybe not use the word guilty. I did a whole lot of mischief. Maybe from this point I'm going to be a better human being. The listener or the guy making the confession and the person making the confession will feel better. I don't know, I believe nobody took up on this idea. Thanks.
Oh yeah, more questions. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add to that. More questions.
Let's get some more. Okay, right here, and then there's some. Let's get both questions, and then. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Something that really stood out to me was the characterization, how you managed to do that with all the characters in like such a short amount of space. So my question is just, was it a routine thing that you took each character and built it from sort of a crux, or did you just keep adding to each character as it came along, the details and their story arc and everything? Because I think it really flowed really well, each character into another and all throughout their lineage.
Yeah, so I wrote using just a family tree. After I wrote the first two characters, who were the two that were most kind of strongly present in my mind, I made a family tree that looks a lot like the one at the front of the book, except for my family tree also had the dates during which the bulk of the chapters would take place, and also one thing that was happening kind of historically or politically in the background during that time period. So for Kojo's chapter, it was something like the Fugitive Slave Act, or for Abena's chapter, it was the advent of cocoa farming in Ghana. And then I would write chronologically. And so once I finished a chapter, I would begin each new chapter by doing research on whatever it was that I had written, whatever that thing was that I kind of wanted to think about as a starting point to enter the world of that character. And I tried not to outline because I felt it was important to kind of have this feel organic and to have each descendant feel as though he or she was responding to the things that their parents did, essentially. And so, so I just kind of, if I had one kind of plot point in mind, I would write to that. But mostly I was just researching enough to feel as though I could inhabit the world of that character, and then I would close the book because I didn't want to over-research, and just start writing from there.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about the importance of loss throughout the book, whether that's like personal or economic or spiritual, and how you work that in.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about loss in this book, particularly, I suppose, the fact that really for every character, but particularly for the African Americans in this book, their history is really just a history of loss, of these fractured connections, these misconnections. There are characters in here who never know their parents. There are characters in here who are ripped from their children. And this isn't just true of the novel, this is true of our history as well, of American history as well. And so I was kind of thinking about how loss can be passed down generationally, so that you don't realize what you're missing, but you know you're missing something. So that feeling was something that I wanted to play with throughout the book, not just on the American side, but the Ghanaian side as well.
In back.
You mentioned that your family hadn't really talked about, I guess, the Door of No Return and that tour. Did the book spark any conversation in your family?
Yeah, so the question was, I talked about how my family didn't really talk about the slave trade in Ghana, and did the book spark a conversation? It has, yeah, actually. I think, my parents have talked about kind of not learning a lot of this stuff in school. They don't really encounter, certainly they don't encounter the American side of slavery in school the way that we do. And so I think some of the conversation has kind of been more about the things that they've learned on the African American side of the family than it has been about the things that I write about on the Ghanaian side of the family. Just kind of, as immigrants, a way to connect to the experience of America in a way that they maybe hadn't really had to before. So it has opened up those kinds of conversations, which has been really great.
More questions? Yeah, okay. So up here is a woman in the black and white skirt, yeah. And then we see the other hand. All right, then 3 rows back.
You said that you started with 2 prominent characters in mind, and I know the writing process doesn't always mean we get the characters the way you got the characters. So who were those 2 characters that you actually started writing with?
Yeah, the first 2 characters in the book, Afia and Essie, are the characters who appeared first in my mind just on that tour. And their chapters are also kind of the ones that came most fully formed, like the ones that I had to edit the least. Initially, when I started writing this book, I thought that I was going to be writing a book that took place in the present and then just flashed back to 18th century Ghana. So in that way, those characters appeared very differently. But they are kind of the bedrock of this book, I guess.
Historical novels are famous for taking liberties with the truth. So my question is, when you were writing, did you have any struggles trying not to I suppose, skew history because of of a message, or as the characters took on their own emotions and their own lives, did you have trouble keeping them on the path of historical accuracy?
Yes, I mean, I think my general rule of thumb was that, you know, if I came to this crossroads where I had to choose like historical accuracy or the story, I would choose the story. And so in that way, I really just kind of tried to let my imagination take the lead. Obviously, this is really sensitive material, and I wanted to be sensitive to the truth and kind of have historical fact be the scaffolding that held this book up. But I also think that some of the pleasure of fiction is the fact that it can tell emotional truths and the kinds of truths that you don't always get by relying strictly on facts. And so that was just like a line that I had to kind of walk while I was writing, and you know, do it in a way that felt like it was being faithful to the characters while also being faithful to the kinds of people who might have lived through these similar circumstances.
Hi, I was just curious, when you are involved in a process like this, where you have to delve into the darkest aspect of humanity and of our history, when you come to the other side of that, when you've completed that process, how do you not hold on to bitterness and feelings of hopelessness? And I ask because I promised myself, after seeing 12 Years a Slave, I have to give myself a break from movies about the antebellum South. And I was just curious, you know, how do you come to the other side of that and not hold on to that bitterness and that feeling of hopelessness, and how could a human do this to another human being?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really hard, like trying to stay mentally healthy, not just while writing this book, but more so while researching the kinds of things that I'm writing about, because, you know, as bad as any of these characters in the novel had it, there were real people who had it worse and who were going through similar circumstances day in and day out. And so I felt this kind of duty to them to tell their stories, fictionally, obviously, but to tell it in a way that felt true and honest. For my part, I guess I didn't work on it all day. You know, I kind of gave myself lots of breaks and lots of space. And after I finished a first draft of it, I didn't even look at it for like 3 months. I just kind of set it aside and did other things. And I think that was in part to help bring fresh eyes to it once I returned to it, but also because the subject matter was so heavy that I did need some space from it. But that is a difficult thing to do.
There was a couple of two hands there. I'll take Sansara and then the person in front of her.
Hi. Whoa. I'm in front of the speaker, so that's a bad place to be with the microphone. I have two questions. I was going to stand up so I could see you, but I don't want to make it screech. One was actually about the idea of, to put it one way, of a curse, of a lot of explanations that people make for their lives of who they were born to, the conditions of their birth, the conditions of their mother, whatever the family tradition, whatever the family background. And that's a lot of, on a certain level, that's a lot of how people explain their lives in this story. But then the way you tell the novel, I found this very, really illuminating, is that you're telling their stories and you're actually showing the larger forces that were shaping them. It wasn't really a curse. It wasn't really that she was born in a fire. It was colonialism. It was the Fugitive Slave Act later. It was these larger conditions that are happening that are shaping people's lives. And I think a lot of times people make explanations and they tell stories, and that's the way they understand their lives and their history. But it's also important to look back on it and to put it in a larger context. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on that. Sort of, there's a story being told on different levels throughout this book. So that was my first question. How you see the relation between the stories people tell about themselves and then looking back with larger historical perspective. And my second question actually overlaps with what the woman said just prior, which is that, first of all, it's an incredibly ambitious book. And I have to commend you. It's very daring, and it deserves a lot of commendation to undertake such a, because you can't understand any of these individual episodes as deeply as you do without seeing their larger context. And so towards the end of the book, you have a young man who grew up in Harlem, who has this whole backstory, and he's in school and he's researching and he's up against what he feels is an enormous struggle to pursue the research, and how enraging the whole experience is. And I just wondered a little bit how much that might have dovetailed with your own experience in trying to grapple with this, and like she said, how did you come through it, but also how did you persevere and feel up to the task? Because I think it's really important that people feel up to the task.
I think I had a lot in common with those last two characters, but Marcus in particular, when he's describing the way that his project kind of balloons outward and outward and outward, is really just basically how I felt about writing this book. But I did feel like if I was going to write a novel that talked about slavery, I wanted to do it in a multifaceted way, a way that represented a lot of different people, and also in a way that kind of showed the ways that slavery is still strongly felt. I wanted to show the lasting legacy, and I didn't see any other way to do it than to spend the time and to write this book. And then to your first question, I think in part it was just kind of a way for the characters themselves to I suppose just stay mentally healthy and kind of figure out the kinds of things, the kinds of language that gives them comfort. Whether for a character it might be the church, but for another character it might be the idea of a spirit visiting them, or of a curse. And I wanted to lend validity to those methods of thinking, because I think they are important. Even if we at a distance can say these things were colonialism and slavery and whatever, it doesn't feel like that in the moment for a lot of people who are under these circumstances. So I kind of wanted to bring it down to this elemental level of what they might be feeling and how they might describe their own trauma.
I'll get over here. I was wondering about the title of the book, Homegoing, and kind of at what point in the process that was, the right choice, and where you saw that related to the narratives of all the characters throughout the book.
Yeah. So I liked the title Homegoing. I was thinking about homegoings as black funerals. The idea traditionally was that when a slave died, his or her spirit could return home to the country from which he or she was ripped, or that they could return home to heaven, however that home is interpreted. And I felt like that was particularly resonant for a book like this that is trying to connect this broad diaspora, trying to connect home for a group of people who have been moved around in all of these different ways. How do they find home? How do they create home? How do they go home? And so kind of once I landed on the word homegoing, it felt like it fit.
Well, I'll give you all, let's think of something else. I have a couple of things to say, but I'd like to get everybody in on this.
I'm just curious, so in the process, obviously this is a book that traces different generations. In the process of you writing it, did you get any opportunity to explore your own family's history?
I actually didn't. I mean, I suppose I could have, but I didn't really seek it out. I think in part because I didn't want to feel like I had to be faithful to any of my own family story, and I didn't want it to kind of cloud what I wanted to do for the characters. So I didn't really seek it out, though, again, I did visit my mother's hometown, and I went to Kumasi. Like, my mother's a Fanti, and she's from the central region, and my father's an Ashanti. And those are the two ethnic groups that are represented in this book. So in those kinds of ways, I did touch on my own family story, but I didn't get into any of the specificity of those stories.
And I'd just like to say thank you for connecting all of these stories throughout the years as a Black American from the South. Sorry. I knew that my grandfather was a sharecropper, and you grew up learning about slavery, but I think I'd always found a way to compartmentalize like what had happened to people years and years ago versus what had happened to my own family. So sorry, but thank you for telling this story and just like giving me a personal way to connect to these ancestors of my own, and that a lot of us, I think, you have to find a way to separate the two, because like how do you get through the day knowing that your family went through something like this? So I just want to say thank you very much. It's wonderful to see you speak. And then my other question is, what else are you reading, and is there anything else you recommend us as fans of you and your work, anything else you recommend that we read?
Thank you so much for sharing that. Right now, I am reading the essay collection, The Fire This Time, that was edited by Jessamine Ward. Has a wonderful array of Black writers writing essays and poetry, people like Jessamine Ward herself, and also Kima Jones, other writers that I really admire are in this book that's kind of in conversation with James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, which is another book that I love. So I definitely recommend that. I think Americana is great. It came out while I was writing this book, and it was really just wonderful to see another book that was kind of engaging in diaspora in the present day, and kind of, it felt like just opening this door for these conversations to start to happen. So Adichie's work has been really important to me. My favorite book ever is Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. So if you haven't read that, I always recommend it. And the book that I read before I started writing this book, as you see it now, was 100 Years of Solitude. And that book is, I think, just one of the, as a writer, it's one of the most daring and ambitious books that I've ever read, and it felt permissive, it felt like the kind of book that was like, you can do whatever you want. So I really recommend that book, especially for writers who kind of are trying to do something that might be a little messier than the average novel.
Well, I just have to comment that you're mentioning 100 Years of Solitude. Back to the question of historical novels, history, and being true to the story. I think this is an important question. That's an important reason why we even have a bookstore, or why we have a bookstore that doesn't just have political theory and history. As decisive as it is to have political theory, there is no revolution without political theory. If you don't actually have an understanding of how to make a revolution, what it should be for, why the world got this way, then you're not going to get anywhere. You might have tremendous courage, resistance, rebellion, even revolution. But for those of us who've been around a little bit and seen what happened to, we're just going to talk about the continent of Africa, the national liberation struggles of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and what's become of Africa today, you see that without deep understanding of the nature of the system that you're up against and how to actually move beyond this kind of class society, you end up with the same thing replicated in ways that are painful, and they do, frankly, bring tears to your eyes when you think about all that people went through in that period, and now to see the tremendously divided societies with tremendous oppression in it without that much hope. But then on the other side, I'm going to say something again about stories, but since I'm on this tangent, I was on this question of I actually liked Americana a lot too, and I've argued with people, it's really a good book, you should read it. But we were talking over dinner about this abundance right now of of diaspora literature from Africa, that's coming out, just book after book after book, as well as work from Africa. And why is that the case? So two things about that. One, if anybody has the answer to that, please come talk to me later on, or if they got some theories about it. It's a very interesting question because there's just so much that's being published all the time, not only from West Africa, but also from South Africa, Zimbabwe, different countries. So I'm interested in that. I think in one sense it might be, if you will, in some senses, because of the defeat of some of those revolutions, that there is a whole grouping of people who've actually ended up leaving those countries and coming to England, the West, but not leaving behind that history, or at least going to rediscover it with fresh eyes. But my point on story is this, that the story gets to a different level of truth. Now, it's not good if you distort the history for purposes to actually cover up what really happened. But you do have to actually distort some history to get to a deeper reality. You were saying an emotional reality. I agree with that. But even to get to the experience. I mean, when you were reading Ness's story, it was very, very visceral. I'm not saying that Northrop's story, 12 Years a Slave, is not visceral. It is visceral if you read the book, or somewhat the movie as well. But both. But still, there's a way in which you're able to capture the inner life of people that enables people to experience. So you need both of those. You need the history. You need that history. You need to understand in reading a book like The American Slave Coast, which we have here at a wonderful program with Ned Sublette, or The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptiste, to really understand how production was increased on the plantations through what Baptiste calls the whipping machine, the breeding machine in the American Slave Coast. But there's another way in which you capture what it was like to live through there in a different kind of way. And my next question for you is this. There's clearly the pain that Efia's line of the family who lives in Ghana went through. But there's a different kind of pain that runs through those who, Essie's descendants from America, right down to Marcus's father, Sonny, and his grandmother, Willie, that to me felt very, very profound, and I feel that that's a pain that's with us now. And I was saying to you that's what, when I looked at Milwaukee and I saw this in these young people's faces, I said, boy, there's that whole history that's in this novel out there on the streets right now. That whole history is out on the streets. Not just what happened to them and what's deprived today in the prisons today, but that whole history seems to run through in a very perverse but a very painful way. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, or...
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose, people always use this analogy, but it's like this open wound that we never dealt with, slavery in this country, that has been allowed to fester for hundreds of years. And so the pain is visceral and the pain is palpable. And because, there wasn't enough done to rectify it those hundreds of years ago, I think it's something that we're going to continue to see crop up in these movements and continue to feel for a while longer.
So I think we're going to move now to end the formal part of the program. I do also want to say to the sister who talked about how this novel helped her confront her grandfather's history, but there's another element too. Just as your parents, and to be honest, my parents didn't talk about their history either, we are now living through a period where there's all kinds of people who aren't talking about, let me put it this way, they're in the upper floors of the castle and not paying attention to what's going on downstairs. And I just want to say that the future of humanity is bound up with standing with those people who are under the floor and working together with them to bring about a whole radically different world. And so that pain you feel is a pain that can be turned into something very positive in terms of looking at the nature of the world you live in and what can be done about it. And I hope that we here at Revolution Books can be part of that process. So with that, I ask you to thank Yaa Gyasi with me.